Hi, my name's Liv and I sculpt things. This week I wanted a bit of a challenge, so I decided to sculpt one of the coolest villains I know. Zant. Even though I was enjoying my painting marathon for the last 2 weeks, I really wanted to sculpt something. I wanted to try making a more humanoid figurine, and I felt like the details on the sleeves and the front sash for Zant would be a nice challenge for me. I started off like I always do with a tinfoil base. I don't like using a lot of clay for these because clay is way more expensive than tinfoil, so this helps bulk out the underside a little bit. One mistake I made really early on that I wish I could go back and change was the fact that I made his legs way too short for what they actually are. I drew this reference photo so I could get the proportions right, but I still neglected his little legs. And later on, I had to make his feet really big so that he could actually stand up. So there are definitely some things that I would change if I would go back and start this again. Zant has a pretty smooth and angular face. His nose bridge is really wide and connects to his forehead. He has very angular cheekbones. He has this very unique double crease on the outside of his mouth that the developers made on purpose so that it would be difficult to tell whether he was frowning or smiling. With this figurine and almost any figurine I make, I like to start sculpting things from the top and then working my way down. I tend to squish any details I make while holding the figurine. So when the face was done, I separated the shape of the arms from the body. I cut out a square piece of clay to act as the decorative cloth that Zant has on the back of his robe. I'm not going to sculpt in the fabric details just yet because of the whole squishing issue. For this figurine, I relied a lot on the official artwork as a reference image. Unfortunately, a lot of the images I found were only showing Zant from the front or at a 3/4 angle, and they weren't actually showing the back of him at all. So in order to get images of the back of him, I used this website called sketchfab.com, which has a lot of 3D models of characters, including Zant, so I was able to see him from any angle that I needed. I added on pieces of clay to the front and the back to represent Zant's draping cloak. He has this sort of double-layered tapestry, so I added that on with some blocked out clay. Under his cloak and armor, Zant has this sort of ridged bodysuit, so I used one of my tools to draw on these tiny depressed lines. I made Zant's football shoulder pads by creating a sort of rough shape of what I wanted, putting it over his head, and then cutting away the excess clay so I got to the right size. One thing I was trying to make sure of was the tapestry on the front has these little chunks that come off the sides, and they had to be visible behind the armor shoulder pads. So I made sure that I cut away enough so that I could actually see them. The edges of the armor don't meet at 90-degree angles. Instead, they follow this sort of slanted angle. So I shaped that out using one of my tools. And I carved more of the bodysuit lines up until the edge of the armor. Next thing was to add 2 little clay snacks to each side of the shoulders. I scored them out, smoothed them down, and then pressed little ridges along each. The next thing to do was the meticulous details on the front of the armor. I wanted to do this with one piece of clay, so I rolled out a really teeny tiny snack and then pressed it along the front in this sort of spiraling and then squared out design. I just want to take this opportunity to say that Twilight Princess is by far the best Zelda game in my opinion. It's my favorite. Zant is one of the best villains, and then later on you get to see his breakdown. It really makes sense in my opinion for his character, based on the things that he said he goes through before the events of the game. Next I added on the gem that sits at the center of the armor, and I added on some of the metal details. On each of Zant's shoulder pads, he has these folded snakes, as well as tiny suns. I made the snakes using single pieces of clay that I pushed down and shaped. They also got the same ridged lines as the shoulder strips. The sun was just a circle of clay that I pressed the sun rays into. Then I repeated this snake and sun design on the back of the shoulder pad. Next thing to add was the outermost ridge on the armor, as well as this squared off swirly decoration. The next thing I made were these two teeny tiny bows that go on the front of Zant's tapestry. I added on some clay to the ends of the arms to act as the cuffs of the sleeves. I also pressed in some fabric folds that were really satisfying to do. I did my best to separate Zant's legs from the cuffs of his pants. Honestly, sculpting these was really difficult. I kind of trashed all of the video footage, so here's what they look like at the end of everything. Next thing I added on was a weird sort of pleats of Zant's pants. Based on the references I used, they have 2 layers, so I rolled out different lengths of clay and pressed them down onto the body. I added the designs that were on the back piece of fabric, and I also wanted to try my hand at texturing. You take the textured part of one of your tools like this one and run it along the clay before you bake it. This creates a texture very similar to fabric. The sleeves of Zant's coat have a bunch of tassels. Each sleeve has 8 tassels, meaning I had to make 16 tassels in total. I wanted to make Zant's helmet removable, which meant that I had to bake it separate from the body. I made this sort of tinfoil mannequin head that would allow it to stand up in the oven. However, for the helmet itself, I sculpted it directly onto Zant's head. I basically made a cone of clay that I started cutting away, similar to how I did with the shoulder pads. Zant's helmet was very challenging for me. I had to restart a couple times because the proportions were off. At one point, the helmet was like twice the size of what it ended up being. I still think it's a little bit bigger than what it should have been, but it's not so bad that I restarted. The helmet involved me laying down a lot of squared off pieces of clay, similar to this side piece here. He also has these funny sort of face fins on his cheeks. In general, I find this helmet is very fish-like. Whenever I was sculpting it, all I could see was fish. I added on his star-shaped eye holes, added some holes underneath his nose, and he also had these ridges on the top fin of his helmet. The back of Zant's helmet was described as the developers as looking like a sort of totem pole. I decided to keep a full cut of the bottom part of his helmet in, but I just sped it up by 500. The premise for the other parts of the helmet were the same. I basically just drew the lines on using one of my tools, and for the eyes, I added on small circles of clay that I pressed down into sort of spirals. I didn't keep track of how long this sculpture took me, just like I don't really keep track of almost anything I make. Zant himself took about 3 days to sculpt, about 5 to 6 hours each day. The helmet itself took about 2 days, with one day being me sculpting the totem faces on the back. So they definitely were time consuming. If I were to compare designing things by adding clay on to taking clay away, like I did with the faces on the back of this helmet, I definitely prefer taking the clay away or pressing it down. I find it's very similar to drawing, and I like that the details don't come off of the clay so much, so they're more flush with the overall figure. This is what the bottom face ended up looking like. I didn't really film any of the other faces, so here's a tiny snippet. And this is what it looked like after it was all done. After priming, we can get on to painting. I was really low on black paint, so I mixed a sort of custom black using red, blue, and yellow. I would say it's more of a dark purple than a black, which is exactly what I was looking for. His face is a sickly bluish white, and I also covered his bodysuit in raw sienna. I filled out the details of the bodysuit using darker browns, and I also added some lighter browns as highlights. Two aspects of Zant's face that I knew was going to be very difficult for me to do with paint was his black eyeliner and his blue forehead tattoo. I didn't even bother trying to paint them on, I just used really fine tipped pens instead. I think in the end I really got the effect I was looking for. His eyes are yellow and they have a little bit of orange around the edges, and I covered them later on in Mod Podge so they had a nice shine to them. For the 16 tassels, I didn't prime the part of the tassel that I was going to glue onto the figurine. Just like on the ends of the sleeves, I didn't prime that either. Whenever I glue them on, I want to be gluing clay to clay and not primer to primer, because it's more likely for them to snap off if the primer just lets go of the clay later on. So I painted the tops of the tassels in red, the knot in a sort of brown, the bottom got a coat of a light blue. Then I painted on some blue and black line details to the insides and the outsides of the red part of the tassel. The next thing to paint was the metallic parts of the armor. I used Liquitex heavy body acrylic for this. I've never used Liquitex products before, but whenever they say heavy body, they really mean it. The paint that came out of this was like glue, basically. I had to do 2 coats of the metallic silver on the helmet and the shoulder pads. The shine I got from this silver paint was so beautiful. In the future, if I'm ever going to sculpt something that has like armor or metal components to it, I'm definitely going to be using this same paint. The next thing I did on the armor was ageify the metal a little bit. In the reference photos, it's not a perfect silver, it's sort of a mossy aged color. So I mixed some sap green with a lot of water to create a light wash. I then ran it across the metal and then used a cloth to pick up the extra color. In doing this, I accidentally removed some of the silver paint as well. I guess 2 hours wasn't long enough for this to dry, so later on I had to go back over the parts that I removed with some more silver paint. I did the same wash technique with some dark brown, and I also added dark brown around the creases on the, I guess, jawline of the helmet. For the design on the front of the tapestry, I really utilized the reference photo for this. I don't really know how to describe the design, it's just kind of there, I guess. For this, I used brown mixed with white and a little bit of yellow, and then the blue was a grayish blue mixed with white. Unfortunately, a lot of this is out of focus. Whenever I'm painting something close up, I have to take my glasses off because I can't actually see close up if I have my glasses on, and I'm just going to use that as an excuse for why I was out of focus. That's all. Thankfully, the parts of me painting the blue lines weren't out of focus, so at least I have these. Also, that line that goes down the center is so teeny tiny. Oh my god. I decided to do the same ageifying technique on the back part of the fabric. After this, I got to move on to the part of this figurine that I was most excited for. The designs on Zant's sleeves glow, and I really wanted to recreate that, so I bought some glow-in-the-dark powder online. The one that I got starts off white, and whenever it glows, it turns into this bluish teal color. This stuff is toxic, so I wore some gloves for safety, and I used a spoon that I was okay with throwing out after I was done. Since I wanted the teal to still show up whenever Zant was in regular daylight, I decided to mix a custom teal color using some white, green, and blue. Then I added to it some matte medium, as well as the glow dust. The initial batch of paint I mixed didn't glow as much as I wanted to, so I had to use 2 scoops of the glow powder. I also had to keep adjusting how much medium I added. Since the lines were going to be relatively thin, I also wanted the paint to be thin, so I added a fair amount of medium to get a pretty viscous consistency. And you can actually see which parts of the paint have the glow dust in them. I painted 4 lines onto the front of Zant's cloak, and 4 overlapping lines on the back. For the sides, again, I heavily referenced the 3D model that I found online. One thing I found that the glow powder ended up doing to the paint is it made it very tacky, and usually whenever you add medium to paint, it causes it to take longer to dry, but the powder made the paint dry really quickly, which I thought was kind of funny. The sleeve designs are basically a 4-legged swirly spider with an eyeball and 8 little snake heads. I repeated the same pattern on the other sleeve, and then I super glued on 8 tassels onto each sleeve cuff. With all of the tassels glued on, I went back in with some black and painted over the exposed clay on the cuffs. I also added a little bit more black in the folds on the sleeves. And with that done, we can get on to the final reveal. This figurine was so much fun to make. I literally loved every second of it. I loved the tiny designs. I loved the metal armor. In the future, I want to make more figurines that have armor like this because it was so enjoyable for me to paint. I love that I can take his helmet off to have his face underneath. And I love the fact that he glows in the dark. It's literally so cool and inspired me for next week's video, which I hope you'll stick around to see by subscribing. Thanks for watching, and leave a like if you liked it. Bye!
Thank you!